The Orith's Prime Assembly Hall was a cathedral of cosmic power, a chamber that pulsed with the presence of 100 alien civilizations. The air hummed with layered dialects, whispers blending into an overwhelming drone of authority and disdain. Humanity, the upstart species, stood before them, small in number but unshaken. Elliot Vance sat at the lone human delegate station, hands folded, his expression an unyielding mask. He had been in war zones, in backdoor negotiations that held the fate of nations in the balance, but nothing compared to this. A galactic tribunal where Earth's fears and strategies were being dissected and mocked. Across from him, Grand Chancellor Xyroth of the Velquari Dominion clicked his mandibles in what passed for amusement among his species. The insectoid's chitinous form gleamed under the soft glow of the assembly's crystalline ceiling. His multifaceted eyes fixed on Vance with a calculated air of superiority. "The humans have convened yet another summit," Xyroth began, his voice a rasping vibration. "They bring warnings of war, speak of caution, yet their history is nothing but blood and destruction. Tell me, Ambassador Vance, is this some elaborate attempt at humor?" Laughter rippled through the assembly. Not the mirthful kind, but one laced with derision. The Drexer representative, Lorik, a hulking reptilian with emerald-hued scales, let out a guttural chuckle, his ridged tail flicking against the floor. "I must say," Lorik mused, "it is impressive how a species that has barely crawled out of its gravity well believes it can teach the elder races about war." Vance did not flinch. He simply exhaled slowly, his blue-gray eyes locked on Xyroth's. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, could sense the silent expectations of his people, of the fleet that orbited the system's edge awaiting his word. From the periphery, Commander Adrian Holt remained still, his posture deceptively relaxed. He was here not as a speaker, but as a quiet enforcer, his presence a reminder that humanity's diplomacy was always backed by steel. High Arbiter Luther of the Signari Confederation, the only voice of balance among them, cleared his throat, his avian features twitching in thought. His taloned fingers tapped against the polished table. "Perhaps," Luther said carefully, "we should listen before dismissing their concerns outright. The humans have endured much in their short existence. Their ability to survive repeated self-inflicted catastrophes is unparalleled." Xyroth turned toward Luther with the slow deliberation of a predator indulging a weaker creature. "Survival does not equate to wisdom. Their fear of war is misplaced. The Dominion does not flinch at conflict. We have known battle before their kind even discovered fire." The assembled council murmured in agreement. Vance let the tide of voices wash over him. He waited, allowing them to bask in their own arrogance. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice measured but firm. "You misunderstand us," he said, his words slicing through the noise. "Humanity does not fear war. We fear what happens when we commit to it." Silence. For the first time since the summit began, the room hesitated. The shift was small, but perceptible. Some leaned in, intrigued. Others stiffened, sensing an undercurrent of something they had not expected. Xyroth tilted his head, mandibles clicking once. "Elaborate." Vance's gaze swept the chamber, ensuring every delegate met his stare. He needed them to understand not just through words, but through presence. "We have fought wars where entire generations were consumed," he continued. "We have witnessed annihilation not by outside forces but by our own hands. We have pushed the limits of destruction beyond reason, and we have done so time and time again. And yet, each time we have learned. We have refined our understanding of battle, of devastation, of the cost of unchecked aggression." Lorik scoffed. "Empty boasts." Vance did not acknowledge the interruption. Instead, he placed his hands on the table, fingers splaying as if grounding himself. "You mock us," he said, his voice dipping lower, steady as a predator before the strike. "You think our reluctance makes us weak. But tell me, Chancellor, do you know what it means to erase a world? Not conquer it, not subjugate it, but turn it into nothing more than irradiated dust, unfit for life for the next 10,000 years. Several council members shifted uneasily. Xyroth, however, remained unmoved. "Are you attempting to frighten us, human? A poor strategy." Vance's lips curled into the shadow of a smile, devoid of humor. "No, I am attempting to educate you." Xyroth's mandibles flared, a clear sign of irritation. Before he could speak, Vance leaned forward further, his tone sharpening. "We understand something you don't," he said. "You war for resources, for territory, for dominance. When we war, it is for survival. And that, Chancellor, is the difference between us. You assume war has limits." His eyes darkened. "We do not." The room was utterly still. The laughter had died. The mockery had withered. A flicker of something unfamiliar passed through Xyroth's alien gaze, but he smothered it with practiced arrogance. He exhaled sharply, as though dismissing a moment of unease. "An amusing perspective," Xyroth finally said, though the confidence in his voice had cooled. "But you forget your kind is still young. You have not yet faced a true war, not one that spans entire systems." Vance's expression did not change, but the air around him did. Commander Holt, silent until now, shifted ever so slightly. His posture remained loose, yet something about his stance radiated readiness, a predator sensing the moment before the strike. Vance slowly stood, his movements deliberate, calculated. "You believe we haven't," he said. "That is your mistake." He stepped around the table, closing the distance between himself and Xyroth. The room bristled as security personnel tensed. But Vance did not reach for a weapon. He didn't need one. Standing just a breath away from the Chancellor, he tilted his head slightly, his voice quiet but thrumming with certainty. "Tell me, Chancellor," he murmured, "what happens when a species with no limits is pushed too far?" Before Xyroth could react, before the security forces could move, Vance's hand shot forward. His fingers clamped around Xyroth's throat. The insectoid's eyes widened in shock, a gasp escaping him as his segmented exoskeleton creaked under the pressure. The room erupted into chaos. Council members rising, voices overlapping in alarm. Weapons were drawn, but no one fired. For a brief, electric moment, Vance held his grip, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady. Then, just as suddenly, he released Xyroth. The Chancellor staggered back, his composure shattered, mandibles clicking furiously in outrage. Vance straightened his uniform with slow precision before speaking, his voice carrying over the stunned assembly. "You sit here mocking us," he said, "but the difference between us is simple." He met each delegate's gaze, letting the weight of his words settle. "We don't start wars." His eyes locked onto Xyroth's once more. "We end them." The room stood in stunned silence, and Vance turned and walked away. Vance did not sit. He remained standing, his posture calm but absolute, his hands folded behind his back in the way a soldier would stand before an execution. He had delivered his warning. Now he let them absorb it. Across the table, Lorik of the Drexer Dominion exhaled a slow hiss, his reptilian gaze narrowing. Unlike the Velquari, the Drexer respected strength. They thrived on the brutal realities of war. And yet, even Lorik was watching Vance now, with something that bordered on caution. Perhaps even something darker, an understanding that humanity might not be the fragile, war-fearing species the Council had assumed. Xyroth finally found his voice, a rasp of barely contained fury. "This is an outrage," he spat, his clawed hand rubbing at the throat that had just been in Vance's grip. "This display of aggression will not be tolerated." Vance exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Aggression?" His voice was smooth, too controlled. "You mistake education for aggression." The murmur of the Council rose again, some in outrage, others in quiet intrigue. High Arbiter Luther, the only one who had thus far avoided outright mockery, leaned forward, his talons steepled against the table. Then educate us, Ambassador, he said, his voice level. Enlighten us as to why humanity holds such fear of war. The chamber settled. The demand had been made. Vance could feel the pulse of history waiting to be unraveled, a weight pressing against him. He had not come to be a teacher, but it seemed they had no choice but to learn. His voice was steady when he spoke again. You call us young, he began, a fledgling species. And in the grand measure of the cosmos, perhaps we are. But the measure of a species is not in its years, it is in its scars. There was no laughter now, no scoffs, only silence. We have warred with each other for thousands of years, he continued. From the moment we sharpened stones to the era of nuclear fire, we have killed for land, for power, for ideas. We have torn our world apart more times than I care to count, each time believing we had reached the limit of destruction, and each time surpassing it. But we learned what others never had to, that war is not a game, that the cost is not just land or resources. It is existence itself. His gaze swept the assembly, searching for any sign of understanding. Some were still impassive. Others listened now, with quiet intent. When we first split the atom, we did so believing it would end all war, Vance continued. We thought the sheer magnitude of destruction would force peace. But it didn't. It merely raised the stakes. And when we took our first steps beyond our planet, war followed. The Mars conflict, the lunar sieges, the 10-year insurrection that burned entire cities across 3 worlds. We fought, and we fought, and we fought, Xyroth scoffed, though there was something brittle in the sound. And yet you survived. Hardly unique. Vance did not smile. No, he agreed. But we survived by embracing something you clearly cannot fathom. His hands pressed against the table, the steel in his voice unyielding. Total war. The words sent an imperceptible ripple through the room. Those who understood war, those who had studied it, flinched in the subtlest of ways. But Xyroth only sneered. An empty term. Vance's head tilted slightly, as if studying a particularly slow student. Is it? He let the moment stretch before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, but far deadlier. Tell me, Chancellor, when the Velquari wage war, what happens to their enemies? Xyroth straightened, answering with automatic pride. They are conquered, their resources assimilated, their people brought into servitude or disposed of. A flicker of something passed through Holt's eyes at the last words. Vance nodded slightly, but his voice remained even. Efficient, he conceded. Brutal, certainly, but still war with an objective. Still war with limits. His fingers tapped against the surface of the table. Humanity learned something different. We learned that war is not just about conquering. Sometimes, war is about making sure there is no one left to conquer. Xyroth's mandibles clicked, but he did not speak. Vance continued, his words steady and unrelenting. When we fight for survival, we do not just destroy armies. We do not just burn cities. We do not just dismantle governments. His gaze locked onto Xyroth's. We erase nations. We erase cultures. We erase species if we must. When we fight a war to its end, there is no surrender. There is no rebuilding. There is nothing left. A heavy silence fell over the council. You fear extinction? Vance asked, his tone deceptively mild. We do not, because we have come closer to it than any species in this chamber and still found a way to crawl back. That is why we fear war. Not because we cannot fight it, but because we know exactly how far we are willing to go when we do. A quiet, sharp breath came from the Signari arbiter. Luther, ever composed, finally shifted, his feathers ruffling in a subtle motion that might have been discomfort. Lorik, the Drexer, had gone utterly still. Xyroth, for all his arrogance, still refused to yield. But something in his stance had changed just a fraction, just enough. He wanted to call it a bluff. He wanted to believe this was mere posturing. Vance gave him no such mercy. Tell me, Chancellor, he said, voice cutting like a scalpel, If you push a species that does not fear extinction, what do you think happens? Xyroth did not answer. The silence was answer enough. Vance exhaled, as though releasing something heavier than breath. His work was done. He had given them what they had asked for. He turned away from the table, straightening his uniform as he did so. But before he could step away, Xyroth found his voice. "You are still bound by treaties," the Chancellor spat. "By laws. You speak as though your people could unleash such horrors without consequence." Vance glanced back, and this time a small, cold smile flickered across his face. "Treaties," he echoed. "Laws. Understand something, Chancellor. Laws are only followed by those who expect to be held accountable. But when a species is faced with annihilation, when its very survival is in question," his gaze darkened. "There are no laws. There are no treaties. There is only the answer to one question." Xyroth swallowed. "And what is that question?" Vance stepped forward, so close that his words were a whisper, a knife pressed against the Chancellor's mind. "Who is left when the fires die?" He turned and walked away. The assembly hall felt colder now, the weight of Vance's words lingering in the still air. The moment should have passed. The conversation should have shifted, but it hadn't. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Xyroth, who had spent the meeting reveling in his own superiority, now sat rigid, his mandibles twitching in involuntary agitation. The other council members were no better. Some exchanged wary glances. Others kept their gazes fixed on the table in front of them as if afraid that meeting Vance's eyes might make his warnings real. Only Lorik remained impassive, though even he was quieter than before, his scaled fingers drumming against the polished surface of the council table. He had always considered humanity an anomaly, but now something in his expression suggested he was re-evaluating the entire species. Vance, for his part, did not press the silence. He had delivered his message. If the council chose to ignore it, that was their mistake to make. Yet, he could see it, the way the weight of his words had burrowed beneath their arrogance, settling in the deep recesses of their minds. Fear was not something the elder races often acknowledged, but it was there now, flickering just beneath the surface. Xyroth was the first to attempt to reclaim control. His mandibles flared, and he forced a scoff, though it lacked the sharp edge of before. Dramatic rhetoric, he sneered, though his voice was tight. Nothing more. Words alone do not make a species powerful, human. You expect us to believe that Earth, your fragile, insignificant world, wields such power without proof. Vance did not answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and tapped a device embedded into his wrist communicator. The action was subtle, but Holt, standing a few paces behind him, knew exactly what it meant. His expression remained unreadable, but beneath the table, his fingers moved, activating a secured transmission through the subdermal implant in his wrist. The effect was immediate. A low vibration rippled through the chamber, so faint at first it could have been imagined. But then the lights flickered, a barely perceptible shift in the energy fields around them. Several council members stiffened, their attention snapping upward. The station's security officers murmured into their earpieces, confusion bleeding into their rigid stances. Outside the assembly hall, the vast observation windows overlooked the cosmic expanse of Ortha's Prime's orbital defense grid. Beyond that, the void stretched in infinite silence, peppered with the artificial lights of nearby fleets. Yet now, where there had been empty space moments before, something emerged from the abyss. A shadow at first, then a shape, then an armada. It did not decloak in bursts of flickering light, nor did it arrive through slipstream ruptures like so many other war fleets. No, the ships had been there the entire time, lurking unseen, hidden in a way that should not have been possible for vessels of their size. And now, they revealed themselves not as a show of aggression, but as a declaration of capability. The ISS Harbinger led the fleet, its massive form casting a looming silhouette against the station's artificial sun. The Dreadnought-class warship dwarfed the assembly hall's orbital platform, its reinforced hull gleaming under the glow of 1,000 reactor lights. Flanking it were 6 battlecruisers, their sleek designs betraying neither hostility nor restraint. They simply hovered there, silent sentinels watching. Vance did not turn to the windows. He did not need to. He already knew what they would see. Xyrotha's mandibles clamped together in a sharp click, his eyes darting toward the nearest security officer as though expecting confirmation that this was some elaborate trick. The officer, a neutral attendant from the Signari faction, swallowed and whispered something hurriedly into his communicator. The response came in stammering tones. Unidentified Terran warships have decloaked at multiple vector points. No prior detection. No hyperspace signatures. Defensive measures were not triggered. Luther's feathers ruffled, his talons gripping the armrest of his seat. "Impossible," he murmured, his voice barely above a breath. "That level of stealth technology, no species has mastered it to this extent." Vance tilted his head, his expression still unreadable. "No species that you knew of," he corrected. Lorik was the first to recover. The Drexer representative slowly leaned forward, his slitted eyes narrowing. He had seen war. He had commanded fleets. And he knew enough to recognize what had just happened for what it was, not a threat, but a warning. "You were here the whole time," Lorik said, his voice a slow, measured growl. "You allowed us to believe you were unprotected, vulnerable." Vance allowed a ghost of a smile to touch his lips. It seemed an effective demonstration. Xyroth shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor with an unceremonious screech. "This is an act of aggression," he bellowed. "You violate Council protocol." Holt moved then, not with any overt hostility, but with the kind of calculated precision that sent an unmistakable message. He stepped forward, his posture unshaken, his voice calm but firm. "No protocol has been violated," he stated. "Earth's delegation arrived in accordance with Council regulations. We simply chose not to announce the presence of our defense fleet." Xyrotha's mandibles twitched. "That is deception." Vance finally turned toward him fully, his gaze sharp enough to cut. "That is survival," he countered. "And it is precisely what I have been trying to explain to you. We do not fear war because we do not enter it blind. When we fight, we ensure that we will win whatever the cost." For the first time since the meeting began, true uncertainty flickered across Xyrotha's face. He had underestimated humanity. They all had. And now, that mistake had been laid bare for the entire Council to see. Luther's voice was the next to break the silence. "This," he hesitated, exhaling as if struggling to grasp the magnitude of what had just unfolded. "This cannot be undone. The balance of power will not remain the same after today." Lorik exhaled slowly, nodding in quiet agreement. "No," he said. "It will not." Xyrotha's claws curled against the table, his frustration mounting. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. His mind was already calculating, already considering alternatives. But Vance saw it for what it was. Desperation. "You should be thanking us," Vance said, his voice softer now, though no less dangerous. "We did not come here to provoke war, despite what you may think. We came here to prevent one." His gaze swept the room, ensuring each delegate met his stare. "You mock us for our caution, but now you understand why it exists. You believe the galaxy is ruled by those who seize power, who conquer, who expand their dominions without restraint. But we have learned what lies at the end of that path." He stepped away from the table, moving toward the exit with slow, deliberate steps. "We are not conquerors. We are not tyrants. But if war comes to us, if you make the mistake of forcing our hand, you will not face a battle." He paused at the threshold, glancing back one last time. "You will face extinction." And with that, he was gone. The silence in the Galactic Council chamber was absolute. No murmurs, no rustling of robes, no subtle clicks of mandibles or flicking of tails. Just the cold, oppressive weight of realization pressing down on the assembly. Even the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed distant now, insignificant against the enormity of what had just been laid bare. Elliot Vance and Commander Adrian Holt had left the room, but their presence still lingered, as if their words had carved themselves into the very walls. The vast expanse of space beyond the windows was no longer just an endless void. It was now a reminder, a stage upon which humanity had unveiled its terrifying potential. The ISS Harbinger and its fleet still loomed, silent but unmistakable, their mere existence now a shift in the delicate balance of power. Xyroth had not spoken since Vance's final words. He sat rigid, his long fingers curling against the polished surface of the table, as if gripping something unseen. His mandibles twitched in tight, measured movements, his breath shallow. He wanted to refute it, to claim that this was some elaborate bluff. But the cold, logical part of his mind, the part that had allowed him to rise to power, recognized the truth. Humanity had been underestimated, and that mistake could not be undone. Across from him, High Arbiter Luther let out a slow exhale, his feathered crest shifting slightly in thought. His eyes were dark pools of contemplation, his mind running through possible implications. He had seen many species rise and fall, had witnessed empires crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. But never, not in all his years, had he seen a species choose restraint when they so clearly held the advantage. Lorik was the first to move. The Drexer representative, known for his cold pragmatism, slowly leaned back in his seat, his thick-scaled fingers tapping an idle rhythm against the table. There was no fear in his gaze, only a newfound wariness. The Drexer Dominion had long assumed that humanity's penchant for diplomacy was a sign of weakness. But now Lorik saw what lay beneath the surface, something brutal, something patient, something terrifying. "Well," he murmured, his deep voice breaking the silence like a blade through frost. "That was unexpected." Xyroth snapped his gaze toward him, his mandibles clicking in irritation. "You find this amusing?" His voice was tight, barely leashed rage dripping from every syllable. Lorik's lips curled in the Drexer equivalent of a smirk. "I find it enlightening." He studied the window, the silhouette of the Harbinger casting long shadows across the station's orbital defenses. "I have fought in more wars than I care to count. I have seen species wage conflict with everything from plasma weapons to bioengineered horrors. And yet, in all my years, I have never encountered a species that looks at war the way humans do." His gaze flickered back to Xyroth, amusement giving way to something colder. "They do not wage war for conquest. They do not fight for expansion. They fight for survival. And that makes them more dangerous than any empire that has ever existed." Luther finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "They warned us," he said. "Again and again they warned us." His talons drummed against the table once before stilling. "And we laughed." Xyroth exhaled sharply, as though attempting to purge his frustration with a single breath. He turned to the security officers standing at the edges of the room. "Bring me an encrypted line to the Valkyrie High Command," he ordered. "I want immediate military assessments on all known Terran fleets. You want a war you cannot win," Lorik interrupted, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. Xyroth stiffened. "You think I fear them?" "I think," Lorik said carefully, "that if you do not fear them, then you are a fool." Xyroth's mandibles flared in irritation, but Luther spoke before the argument could escalate. "If there is war, it will not be the kind of war you imagine," the Signari Arbiter said, his voice eerily calm. "Do not think in terms of battle lines and fleet engagements. Think in terms of extinction. That is the war they are prepared for." The words settled like a stone dropped into a still lake. No one spoke. A soft chime from the communication panel on the table disrupted the silence. A transmission had been received, routed from the outer perimeter of the station's orbital defenses. "Galactic Council, this is ISS Harbinger, flagship of the Terran diplomatic fleet. Transmission secured and authenticated. Ambassador Vance has authorized a final message. The audio crackled slightly before Vance's voice came through, smooth but edged with steel. I imagine you are deliberating your next move. So let me make it clear to you. Humanity has no intention of striking first. We are not here to conquer, to annex, or to dictate terms. But we are here to survive. And if you make the mistake of forcing our hand, you will not fight an empire. You will not face an invasion. There was a pause. Then Vance's voice dropped to something lower, something colder. You will face an extinction event. The transmission cut. No one moved. Even Xyroth, whose entire being bristled with barely contained fury, remained silent. His mind raced, trying to find a counterpoint, a refutation, anything that could undo the reality that had just been cemented. But there was nothing. Luther was the first to stand, his chair scraping softly against the polished floor. He inclined his head toward the rest of the council, his tone carefully neutral. It would seem that the balance of power has changed. Whether we choose to accept that change or defy it will determine the fate of this galaxy. Lorik chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Let me offer you all a piece of advice, he said, standing as well. I have commanded wars. I have raised entire colonies. I have never once feared an enemy before battle even began. But today, I have learned fear. Xyroth said nothing, his fists clenched, his mind still screaming for control, for a way to turn this moment back in his favor. But there was no path forward except one: submission. Vance had given them an out, a way to avoid what had been promised. The only question was whether Xyroth's pride would allow him to take it. Luther turned toward the council guards at the chamber doors. Send an official response to the Terran delegation. The Signari Confederation recognizes the sovereignty and security rights of Earth and its colonies. We will support a non-aggression pact. Lorik nodded. The Drexer Dominion will do the same. Slowly, one by one, the other delegates murmured their agreement, until only Xyroth remained. His mandibles tightened. His body was rigid, his mind warring with itself. Then, finally, with slow, measured reluctance, he exhaled. His claws scraped against the table as he forced the words through gritted teeth. The Velquari Dominion acknowledges the truce. And with that it was done. A new power had been recognized. A new era had begun. Humanity's legacy was no longer a question of survival. It was a promise, a warning, and the galaxy would never forget it.